We're going to call the meeting to order. This is the regular meeting, first meeting of the Board of Directors of Marin Municipal Water District. And the first order of business is to adopt the agenda. Is there a motion to so adopt?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed. Directors, general managers, announcements. Let's start with directors.
Public expression.
Oh, wow. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
We've got public expression. I do have 2 speaker cards. So the first speaker is Ken Strong.
Good evening. I'm a resident of Green Bay. I'm a one-time ambassador and a member of the Marin Conservation League Climate Action Working Group. In October, we saw a joint presentation by a representative of MMWD and the COO of MCE about installing inline turbines in the lines flowing down from water tanks on the watershed, which seemed like a real win-win proposition for everybody. Ultimately, free energy once it's installed, great resiliency benefits to the district and the like. And I was curious what the status was. We hadn't heard anything about it since then.
This from Inpipe? Was that the company?
No, they were going to be in the. This was just a proposal at this point where they would be installed within the existing pipes flowing down from the water tanks down below.
Yes, yes. No, I mean, what I mean is the company's name. I'm just saying, is this in, we can talk offline about it.
Okay.
Okay.
I know nothing about the company yet.
Do you have a little update for us?
Sure. A brief update is we are in discussions with MCE, looking to collaborate in partnership with them. They're looking for in-county renewable energy, and we have an opportunity. It is a relatively small play for them, yet it makes intuitive sense to capture it if we can. So we're currently in kind of the still the discussion phase, thinking about what grants are out there, looking at costs and paybacks and other considerations, as well as potentially some longer-term, bigger plays. People look at like pump storage for energy and those type of things. So we're very engaged with them at this point. It's premature to, talk about a schedule or where that stands, but our board has supported these types of initiatives, and they do seem relatively interested. Mm-hmm. So we're continued to discuss this and try and move it forward.
Thank you. I mean, what I've heard from them is that they're very interested, and Marin Conservation League is very supportive of this. So we'd urge sooner the better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Frank Schultz.
Hi, my name is Frank Schultz. I am a customer and also a neighbor of yours. I live right next door. I walk by your building just about every morning, either taking the bus or the ferry. I see you have a wonderful flagpole in front of the building, and it's such a good location. It's highly visible. I've never seen a flag. So my request is that you fly the flag, our American flag, our great country. I also do believe it's a statutory requirement. That's not my purpose. I just ask, my request is you please fly the flag of our country.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
We have had, we don't.
Yeah, we used to. I didn't know that.
We'll look into it.
Thank you for
Okay.
letting us know.
We'll follow
Okay.
up on that.
Okay.
Okay. Now, any other public expression for anybody that didn't put in a speaker card? Okay, so now we'll move on to directors and general managers' announcements, and we'll start with Director Russell.
None. None.
Cynthia?
I'll just generally say that the governor has issued a water portfolio that's interesting, and I hope everybody has a chance to look at it, and the comment deadline is February 7th.
Jack? Okay. For me, Happy New Year. Let's hope it's a good one. And we get through this somewhat difficult time together. Ben?
Very briefly, I just wanted to share last month I attended an aqua conference. These are, they have 2 conferences a year in state, and probably half the attendees are district board members, and the agenda is really governed for that, designed for that audience. So I'm going to make an effort on upcoming conferences to share the dates with the board, and to the extent there's interest, staff will work to support the logistics for that. I think periodically it could be of value and interest to the board members to think about attending were you available to do so.
I joined Ben at that meeting.
Director Russell was there.
Okay. Okay. So the next part of the agenda is the consent calendar. I have a question on item 2, which is the Sprint lease agreement. Does anybody have any information about that?
Director
So,
Bergman.
okay, so the amendment to the lease increases the lease, monthly lease by $6,000 a month. Is there a cost of living increase built into the master lease?
I believe there is, yep.
Okay, so we're just adding this additional 10% to cover the 2 additional spaces, antenna spaces.
That's correct.
But the lease itself has a
Master
COLA.
lease,
Okay,
yes.
okay. Okay, that was my question. Thank you very much. Okay, any other questions? Okay, move approval, motion to approve.
Motion to approve the
Second.
consent calendar.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed. Regular calendar, we have the monthly water supply report. That's Mike. Hi, Mike.
Yes, so this is for the month of November, through the month of November. So through the month of November, or in the month of November, we produced 2,212 acre-feet of water, and our total fiscal year production through November has been 13,369 acre-feet, about 7% above last year. This graph provides a comparison of monthly production going back to 2015, and for the month of November, we did have the highest production since 2015, and we think that was likely due to the relatively dry weather we had in November. It was pretty dry. We just had a couple inches of rain. And here's our cumulative precipitation graph showing that at the bottom in orange is the current fiscal year rainfall, and through November we had about 4 inches. Average through November is typically about 10 inches, so we definitely were below. The good news is as of today, we've received 23 inches and average is about 21. So when we present this next month, you'll see that go up.
So you're not worried?
No, not, storage looks good. Our running 12-month potable water production through November was just over 25,000 acre-feet. This presents the reservoir storage for the fiscal year. The top orange graph represents our current fiscal year. So at the end of November, we were just over 60,000 acre-feet. The solid line in black is our average. So even back then, we were about 8,000 acre-feet above average. This chart presents a comparison of our daily production versus max temperature. For the beginning of November, we had production around 26, 27 million gallons per day. The weather was still warm then, and as the weather cooled for the month, by the end of the month, production had dropped to about 23 million gallons per day. This graph presents a comparison of our T&O, taste and odor complaints that come into our water quality lab. For the month of November, we received 33 complaints, and we believe those were due to the changes that we made to the operation of our lakes. Also, we were continuing to have algae challenges in Bontempi. Most of these calls, almost all of them, came during the first 2 weeks of November. Once the weather started to cool, the complaints pretty much dropped off.
So no complaints in December?
I don't know if we have, do we have December numbers?
I thought we had some complaints during the PSPS.
We did. October, we had quite a
That
few
was October?
complaints.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the big month, 55. And so we continued to get a few of those complaints following October, that event, but then they dropped off in the middle of November. So currently, storage looks good. We have 70,450 acre-feet of water in storage, almost 90% of capacity, and 15% above average for this time of year. So storage looks very good. And the weather for the next week will be partly cloudy with highs in the mid-50s, possible rain on Monday and Wednesday.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any questions?
A question here, consumption so far this year compared to last year, it looks like consumption right now is, even though nobody should be watering anything, should be no irrigation going on, it's higher, is that?
Production is higher. You're looking at the billed water numbers. Yes, production through November is higher than it was last year.
Okay, I don't know, maybe, it strikes me as a little surprising, but, yeah, it would seem that water use would be down because no irrigation's going on, I presume. But, okay, it is, I guess.
Well, we had November was sort of dry, wasn't it?
November was very dry, so
Yeah.
that could be
So-
the reason why
yeah.
production is
Okay.
up.
Rains didn't start
But
too
it has dropped. Once the rain started coming, we got down to 14.5 inches, which is typically what we see in the middle of winter.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike.
Thank you.
Okay, so next item is a resolution number 8553.
If I could ask, we could table that, Roger. We thought he was coming this evening, and he's not here, so perhaps we could save it for another time.
Sure.
We should
Yeah.
do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're not sure what happened to him, so.
He's celebrating.
Yeah.
That happens.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll table that for now.
Okay.
And next is our Brown Act presentation.
Yes, before the board this evening is a Brown Act presentation that will be made by Harriet Steiner from the law firm of Best and Krieger. Harriet is a partner in BBK's Sacramento office with extensive experience representing public agency clients on the Brown Act. Harriet is actually an icon in our business. For decades, her
How do you like
practice.
being called
It's
an
the
icon?
hair.
The hair does it, yeah.
I wasn't an icon when I was still dyeing it.
For decades, her practice has focused on municipal law issues, public law issues, the Brown Act, land use, environmental law, wastewater, and municipal water and municipal financing. She has served as the city attorney for the city of Davis from 1986 until 2019 and has represented cities, special districts, and joint powers authorities. She has graciously agreed to come and make this presentation on the Brown Act tonight for us.
Thanks, Mary.
Well, it's nice to be here. I'm going to zip through this because I always bring too much material. But feel free to ask questions as I go along, because if one of you has a question, probably other people in the room have the same question. So we're going to talk about the Brown Act, which is the California Open Meetings Act. And if I can work the clicker. Down button. There we go. Okay. So, so first I should say I'm just going to, this one.
Make sure that this is also, just so we can capture your.
Okay. Okay, so this isn't a total survey. I'm just going to go through some issues that I thought the board might be interested in, a little bit of background, but I'm not going to go through every single part of the Brown Act. So if you have if I leave something out that you really like, then we can talk about it today or some other time. So first off, I want to talk about the purpose, because we usually do, and it's to guarantee the public's right to attend and participate in local government meetings of legislative bodies. And the Act says that, specifically says that in delegating, that the people in delegating authority to local entities and public servants did not give up their right to see what legislative bodies were doing. They have a right to know, they have a right to participate. And so they retain control, and part of that control is by being able to attend meetings, see deliberations, and participate in those decisions. And in 2004, which was approximately 50 years after the Brown Act was enacted, there was a measure that placed into the California Constitution a provision that says, as a constitutional matter, that people have the right to access to information and to attend public meetings. And so this constitutional article deals with both the Brown Act and the Public Records Act. And so it gives it sort of more gravitas, I guess. And it makes it really clear, especially if you're litigating or arguing about it, that the burden is really on keeping transparency and availability as opposed to doing things behind closed doors. So the goal of the Brown Act is to promote transparency and public trust. So that's public access to meetings, public attendance, and open deliberations and actions. And so the basic prohibition in the Act is that legislative bodies like yours may not hold a meeting where there's a majority of the board present to hear, deliberate, discuss, or take action on an item unless it's been properly noticed and held. And I would just note that that it's an or. So it's hear, discuss, deliberate, or take action. It does not require that you actually take action. If you just meet to deliberate or talk or do a workshop, that's still a meeting. So you can have a whole meeting, we take no action, but it's still a meeting. And this also includes technological advice, devices, email, text, calls, Facebook, you name it. So just because the Brown Act has not been amended to deal with the fact that we have electronic devices and electronic forums and things like that. So we're still, so we still have an act, and then we try to apply it to the electronic helpers that we have these days. And we'll talk about that later in the presentation. So again, so a meeting is a gathering of a majority of the members, so a quorum of your members to hear or discuss an item within your subject matter jurisdiction. And so your subject matter jurisdiction is anything that could properly come before you. And we just talked about this, so I'll keep going. So the Brown Act does permit you to talk to individuals. That's not a meeting. If one of you talks to somebody, either another member of your board or somebody in the public, that's not a meeting. You can express an idea, that's not a meeting, unless you do it at a meeting and it wasn't on the agenda correctly. So, but individual action is not subject to the Brown Act. It's always collective action that is. And also one-way information can go to the board. So your staff can send a memo out to the whole board. That's not a meeting. It's when you start discussing the memo that you create a meeting. So that one-way communication is fine, but not if it turns into backwards. It's the old adage that we say, just don't hit reply all, please. So those are things that are allowed. I'd note the Brown Act has a long list of what's a meeting and what isn't a meeting, and how you deal with different types of meetings. And I'm not really going to talk about that too much, except with respect to committees as we go forward with this. So, so committees are dealt with in different ways in the Brown Act. And if your board creates a citizens committee, that becomes a legislative body. So legislative bodies, if you read the act, like the first time I read the act, I went, well, legislative body, that's just the board of directors. That's just the city council. That's just not right? Because a legislative body, as used in the act, is any body, any multi-person body that's created by state law, federal law, or an action of the local agency board. So by resolution, by ordinance, or even by formal action of the board. If you create a planning body or a study body that's made up of citizens and the like, that would in and of itself become a legislative body subject to the act. Okay. So there is one exception that I wanted to talk about a bit, and that's advisory committees that are made up solely of members of your board. So if you create an advisory body that's less than a quorum, okay, so you have 5, I think. So, so less than a quorum would be 2. So your board could create a committee that's 2 members of your board. So how do you deal with that? And that was a big issue, 20 years ago or so, because a lot of city councils and boards of supervisors and also special districts do a lot of their work, their sit down and really study and learn and make recommendation work through committees of the board. So it's not unusual to have like in the city of Sacramento, there's, you know, a public works committee, a finance committee, a legislative committee, you know, they have like 6 or 7 committees, right? And they do a lot of work through that committee system. And it used to be that since it was less than a quorum, it wasn't subject to the open meetings law. So there was an amendment that was very controversial at its time when, and it says that if you create a standing committee, that in and of itself becomes subject to the open meeting laws, even if it's less than a quorum. So a standing committee has a continuing subject matter jurisdiction, your finance committee, your public works committee, et cetera, or it has a fixed meeting schedule. It meets once a month and does X, right, whatever X is. So if you create an advisory committee like that, or if you have 2 members of your board that have a standing meeting with 2 members of the Board of Supervisors every third, you know, Thursday, that in and of itself is a meeting that becomes a standing committee that then has to be subject to the open meeting laws. But what about other committees? What about ad hoc committees? So I first would note that you will not find in the Brown Act the word ad hoc. What you have here is the negative. If it doesn't have subject matter jurisdiction or it doesn't have a fixed meeting schedule, then it's not a standing committee, and therefore, as lawyers who like Latin, we called it ad hoc. So an ad hoc committee is the kind of committee where something's going on and there's some specific reason why the board wants to have 2 directors who are interested go off and figure something out or meet with citizens or learn about this. And the board says, okay, you 2 directors, please go and learn about this financial instrument and report back to us, right? So they don't have any authority. They're just a board member. And they don't have to meet pursuant to the Brown Act. So they can go out, the 2 of them, they can meet whenever they want. They can meet with neighbors whenever they want. They could schedule an open meeting and notice it, but they don't have to. But the key here is that it's limited in scope. Generally speaking, it's limited as to time. So it's not something that goes on for year in and year out. And it's advisory in nature, and it reports back to the legislative body. So it doesn't actually take any action. Right? And so those committees, those ad hoc committees made up solely of less than a quorum of your body, are not subject to the Brown Act. So I want to just go back to standing committees for a minute, because sometimes we have standing committees and there's a lot of interest in what the standing committee is doing. And so other members of the board may want to go and hear what's going on at the standing committee because they're having, you know, basically an informal hearing or a meeting where they're talking about something, you know, some kind of long-term planning thing or whatever that is of interest. So the Brown Act says that members of the board who are not members of the standing committee can attend, but they can attend only as observers, right? So if there was a standing meeting of a standing committee meeting in this room, and the, 2 of the directors were that standing committee, the other 3 of you could show up, but you have to sit back there and you cannot come up here, right? So you can't participate in the meeting, you can only be an observer. But it's important to know that you can come, but it's also important to know that you can't all of a sudden become engaged in a discussion, because that's a quorum of the board, and then you're having a discussion and you haven't noticed a board meeting. So in talking to Ms. Casey, we talked about a little bit about committees of the whole. So I used to represent the Council of Governments in Sacramento, and they had a 23-member board, which is a little unwieldy sometimes. But so you'd think they would have, less than a quorum. That was like, 11 people, right? They could have a committee, but that was sometimes not enough, because there were some things like all the transportation money went through there. And so there were times when more than a quorum really wanted to sit on a particular committee. And so when I talk about a committee of a whole, I'm talking about a committee that's not less than a quorum. So it's really the board. Right? It may be set up so that only 4 of you usually attend, but it's still, or 3 of you usually attend, but it's still, because it's a quorum, it's still a member of it's still a meeting of the board. And so that is not addressed expressly in the Act at all. They just look at board meetings and standing committee type meetings, right? But it's something that's used from time to time, and I think the important thing about it is to understand that if it's more than a quorum, it is a meeting of the board, right? And that you can set your own rules because you're your own entity, so long as you bear in mind that it always has to be subject to the Brown Act and always has to be properly noticed, right? So the public knows what you're going to do. So if you wanted to act as a committee of a whole to talk about a water issue that's affecting the district, you could do that. It's sort of like a special meeting. You're only going to talk about that. And you could set your rules, but you should know that it will really be a meeting of the board. But again, you're subject to the agenda that you have in front of you. How am I doing? Have I gotten one? I'm running through this as fast as I can. So I wanted to talk about noticing just real fast. Again, sometimes like your board might want to meet with a city council or board of supervisors. Sometimes those are set up so that you go to them and it's only one meeting, right? Or they come to you. But sometimes it's a joint meeting because you both want to take action on something. And well, my recommendation is that when you're having a joint meeting, you set it up like both of you are meeting, right? And so you have you could do it all on one piece of paper and all on one agenda, but it's clear that it's a meeting of the water district and a meeting of the city council. And then you have to follow all the rules that apply to meetings for both entities, with the one exception of like a city has to meet within its jurisdiction. And so if it was meeting and the county, for example, only met in a different city, they could meet in the county because it's still within one jurisdiction.
But that would only be if both bodies had a quorum.
Both bodies have to have a quorum there. It would be an actual meeting of both.
Yeah.
Like sometimes it happens if you're doing a new joint powers agency and everybody's excited and everybody wants to meet and approve the agreement at the same time, so they want to have actual meetings of each body. But there's lots of reasons for that. And then I noted in here that when you set up if you have committees that are full board meeting committees, you want to really look at whether they're going to be special meetings by statute and long-term Merry Old England rules only deal with items that are on the agenda, whereas regular meetings, subject to the restraints in the Brown Act, you can add items to them and things like that. You could not do that if it was a special meeting. And then just to be clear as to the scope. So I was also asked to talk about teleconferencing. It's permitted to do teleconferencing. It has to be noticed. You have to decide in advance that there's going to be a teleconference meeting. You have to have a quorum of your members located within the district. You don't have to be in the same room. You don't have to be in the same building, but at least 3 of you need to be in the district, right? And the other 2 can be wherever they are, as long as you knew in advance where they were going to be. So you could set up, so on your agenda, you could say where it's going to be. And as soon as they got there or before they got there, they posted it so they meet the same posting requirements that you have to have here. And where they are has to be open to the public and accessible, right? And then the one part that always trips people up, because it's hard to remember sometimes, is that when you take action at a teleconference meeting, you have to have a roll call. And that's because a lot of times they're by phone and people in remote places can't tell how people are voting just by having eyes. So it has to be by roll call. So it's really just noticing and then convenience. And it could be any kind of meeting, a special meeting, a regular meeting. It could include closed sessions and all of that. So I wanted briefly, it's not a Brown Act class without talking about serial meetings, daisy chains and spokes. So these are the kinds of ways that people violate the Brown Act, right? Director 1 talks to Director 2, then talks to Director 3. That is a daisy chain. Now that you have all made up your mind, that is a violation because you're deliberating outside of a meeting. Same as if, I'll pick on Mary for a minute. If Mary goes and talks to one of you, then another one of you, then another one of you, and she tells everybody what's going on, and and you guys develop a consensus based on that, she's sort of like your intermediary, and that looks like the old wagon wheel or whatever. And that too, if you develop a collective concurrence, that will also violate the Brown Act. Now that doesn't mean that your general manager or your general counsel or appropriate staff cannot meet with you individually and give you information and have you be able to ask questions. The issue comes when there's cross-pollination, and so that's the thing that you have to watch for. Let's keep going. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about technology, where there's a bunch of issues and probably no really clear answer on a whole lot of this stuff. But so a lot of what we do, an immense amount of work by email and by other types of technology, and so it's easy sometimes because it's so easy to send messages back and forth, or to do that you could really start developing consensus outside of a meeting with a paper trail, I would note, that actually violates the Brown Act. And so it's an area to be cautious. Okay, so let's pick on a city council. So you have a city council, and you have 200 people back there, and there's a big development, and everybody has their cell phones with them or smartphones with them, and they have a bunch of friends out there from whatever side of the, and then, and so then they have a public hearing because, it's like a zoning thing, and everybody has a public hearing, everybody gets 3 minutes. Well, what about the people out there who are sending text messages and emails during the meetings to their council members who they have to have their cell phone number? Is that right? Is that fair? Is that appropriate? Right? So if the council members are sending text messages to the city manager going, "It's freezing in this room, could you please turn up the heat?" That's one thing, right? But if you have, since we're set up for transparency and basically for fairness, it raises significant issues, I think, if the council members are engaging in texting on substantive matters that they're hearing with people in the audience. It gives it sort of breaks the due process rights of people, and therefore raises Brown Act concerns. And so I said, well, if you can, could you just put them on, just turn them off, or just don't do anything substantive on them when you're having a meeting, because it's sort of unfair access. And then if some person in there happens to have 3 members' text messages and sends the same text message to all 3 of them, then we just finished talking about that. So, okay. So you could have a Brown Act violation by texting during meetings or texting not during meetings. But I was, and obviously it has to be about public business. It can't be about your kid. If it's about your kid, it's just personal. If it's freezing in the room, and so I wanted to just briefly talk about meeting documents, because that raises the same kind of issue. The public, as you know, gets the agendas, has the right to review stuff and all that. And so if writings are distributed to a quorum of the board during a meeting, the public has a right to see those documents. Like if staff comes here and brings you a new document during your meeting, they generally will bring a stack so people in the audience can see them, right? So if you're texting during the meeting, then the public has a right to see that, right? And which sort of is awkward. Because it's not, it's kind of hard to okay, wait, let me take a screenshot and I'll go print that for you. So it's just another reason why you need to be cautious, and, and it sort of doesn't fit that well, but it still is subject to the same rules. And so, I've worked for public agencies for a long time. Every single one of my clients wants to use social media. My kids only use social media, I think. And it's easy, it's inexpensive. You can send messages to the public. You can have Facebook pages. You can reach people, citizens and residents that you don't reach in other ways. So it has a lot of good things about it. And it can increase transparency. It could provide for feedback. It can foster information sharing. It can do a lot of really good things. However, you can also end up having a meeting that wasn't properly noticed, and it wasn't properly held because it wasn't, because you weren't all in a room and you didn't have an agenda and all the rest of it. So it could be totally open to the public in the sense that, Twitter is open to the public, but it doesn't meet the requirements of the act. And so one of the really hard things about neighborhood blog type things and Twitter is, well, okay, so something happens on Twitter and you have an account and you say something back, and then director number 2 says something back, and then director 3 says, well, I want to say something back too, And so it creates this sort of weird dynamic for which the Brown Act does not answer, except to say that if you're using Twitter, and in using Twitter you develop a consensus or you have deliberations on Twitter, that in of itself could constitute a violation of the Brown Act. We have not had that case yet. But I could see a judge saying, well, yeah, everybody who's on Twitter could do this, but it wasn't noticed. They didn't know you were going to do it. You had to be noticed. You can't expect everyone to be on Twitter all day long, every day. That was improper. So you just need to be careful, or potentially at your convenience have a discussion as to how you might want to handle that as a board. Sure.
So let's say the general manager comes across an article that he thinks would be of interest to all of us and sends it all to us in an email just as an information item.
One-way communication is okay.
Just
Okay. Yeah.
Just don't reply all.
So yeah. So Mr. Hornstein, he can send things to you, but when you reply, just reply to him. Don't, if
So
you reply
sending-
to everyone, then before you know it, you're having this discussion. I mean, the first reply that says thanks, But if
Yeah.
it says thanks and here's my opinion, and then all of a sudden before you know it, it's like you're talking back and forth as if you're in the same room.
Yeah, but a blind copy takes care of that.
Hopefully, yes. But it's good. You can take the white out and put it over the.
On your phone.
But and as we know, Twitter, Twitter is kind of a public, forum. When you create your Facebook page and you have comments, you create a public forum. If there's someone who doesn't like you, as our president found out, you cannot block him because you've created a public forum. So there's other things about, I'm just talking about the Brown Act, but there's other, sort of First Amendment activities, and rights that go along with using some of these social media outlets as well. Okay, and we were just talking about this. So, we've had numerous meetings at the League of California Cities where bunches of city attorneys have sat around and tried to figure out the best way. We have had council members come in, some council members, they're so used to doing social media, they have their own social media from before and during their campaigns, and then they get elected and we go, oh, wait, no, stop, and so there's a lot of friction there. And I think it just requires people to be thoughtful about it and to understand what the obligations are. Because it's, a lot, I've seen many times where council members, and maybe some of you, have run for a board because you're incensed about something that's happening on your block. And then you get here and we say, sorry, you live within 500 feet of that. You can no longer participate in that matter. So there's a lot of constraints in different laws. But this is just one that I wanted to bring up because it's sort of new and evolving. And it doesn't have it's not special in that it's all subject to the same rules. It's special in that it's different than the way people communicated when the Brown Act was written. And so it has its own pitfalls. Okay, so this is a hypothetical where you guys are you're seeking a new general manager. And it's out sort of in a blog of some sort or on Facebook. You put on Facebook, we're seeking a new general manager. And the first comment comes from board member number 1 who says, we need someone with really good skills. And the next board member says, and they have to know a lot. And the next board says, anyone would be better than the last guy. And then a resident says, what about the Brown Act? So it's just indicative of how you could end up innocently, giving a comment, and then when you put them all together and they're always there and they're there pretty much forever, there are questions being raised because it's not being done in the normal forums with the normal amount of notice. So don't hit reply all. Don't send messages to the entire board that sort of says, well, my opinion is such and such, and everybody should vote with me. I would note too, like, you know, there's lots of reasons not to make up your mind before you do something at a board meeting. Don't comment unless you really have to. And if you do, think about how you guys, I mean, it's good, I think, to think about in advance how the board wants, you know, if the board has a consensus as to how they want to deal with that. And boards are different. Some boards don't care. Some boards only have 1 or 2 members who, you know, have a computer that they have on Facebook all the time or have a Twitter account. But some boards have 5 members that are very, very active, and it's a friction point for them. And so it's good to talk about it, I think, in advance and see if you can have guidelines or something like that. And did I do that at the right amount of time?
Perfect.
Okay, so that was really, really fast. I obviously did not talk about how to set up a meeting, how to notice, what happens if you get in trouble, you know, any of those kinds of things, how to do a closed session. I know, Mary, you know, you know about all that stuff. But anyway, does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. Is there a rule about prejudging an item? You kind of just touched on it, such that if you publicly sort of state your opinion before the meeting, that your vote could be challenged as prejudgment or prejudice?
So there are due process rules. And especially when you're having a hearing where there's a right to have a hearing, where people have the right to come forward and give you their views. And so that hearing should be meaningful, and that's why I said it's a due process issue. And the process that's due depends often on whether it's a legislative item or an administrative hearing. So it's different if it's like a general plan amendment versus the revocation of a use permit or the revocation of a water permit. So there are that which has much tighter rules than your legislative acts.
Okay.
Right? But it's the idea that if you're going to be sort of like a judge, you know, or part of a panel that's making a decision, and you want to be transparent and fair, that everybody should have the right to come and give their opinion, and you shouldn't prejudge what your opinion would be, right? So there have been times when elected members have stated their opinions and said, well, I'm going to do this and I'm never going to do anything different, and I don't care what anybody says to me. And then the people on the other side of that issue who also feel deeply say, well, how can you be fair when you haven't even heard what I had to say yet? So yes, there's a rule. Yes, it's complicated.
Kind of like the Senate, huh?
Yeah, not like the kind. But, you know, but I know back, do you remember when we were all involved in oil trains? I don't know if you guys were involved in that, but in the Valley, like I was city attorney of Davis then, and the train tracks go right through Davis. And then Valero wanted to build a big receiving station in Benicia, and there'd be hundreds of cars there were like 200 cars filled with
Explosive oil.
We're going to go through the town every day. And it was a really big deal. And one of the Benicia council members made her opinion very well known and a very well, and that was a problem, I mean, so it caused a problem for the city and for the council because the lawyers involved, not, on all the different sides, said, wait a minute, you've already made up your mind. Right? So it's just something to be cautious of. I'm not saying you can't say, well, my inclination is X, but I haven't heard all the evidence, I haven't heard it all yet. You can't always say, that as long as you still have an open mind, generally what we're doing here, is now if you're doing a personnel hearing, or you're doing, some sort of revocation of a vested right, then Mary, I'm sure, will give you exactly what the rules are for that.
Good. That helps. Thanks a lot.
So,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I just want to say thank you. This was super helpful. I know you felt you were rushing, but this was super helpful. And there's been a lot of public interest in this. So I guess my request to staff, I guess maybe to you, Jeannie, I'd like to, if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to have this posted on the website in a way that's easily accessible to the public.
Of course.
Great.
Any other questions, Jack?
I understood you to say that if somebody brings a document to, say, a board meeting and they give it to the board members, it has to be shared, or it has to be?
So if the city I'm used to representing cities. If the district creates the document, then it has to be available at the meeting. If a member of the public or someone else comes and hands you documents, then it has to be available the day after the meeting.
Okay. I don't know
I mean, it's subject to somebody asking for it, of course, but, yeah, and there's specific timeframes and stuff like that. I mean, I would guess your staff does that routinely.
Okay, thank you.
If someone asks for it, we give them whatever has been handed off to us.
Right.
I mean, the only exception to that would be like an attorney-client privilege memo.
Right,
or
right.
something.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions, comments? Is there any public comment on this? Okay, great,
Thanks again.
great class. Thank you
for
very
having
much.
me.
Okay, thank you very much. It was really good. Okay, moving on to our next agenda item. Item 7 is designation of the finance manager as interim treasurer. And I'm not sure who.
I'll
it's
take
Ben's.
this fairly self-explanatory with the departure of Charlie Duggan, who was the board's treasurer. The position's vacant, and we are in recruitment for it, and we anticipate it to be filled in the next couple months. In the interim, we're requesting that our finance manager, McYoung, be designated as the interim treasurer and be able to fill the appropriate roles and duties of that function until the finance director and treasurer position is filled.
Okay, sounds like a good move. Any discussion? Any public comment?
Motion to approve?
Is there a second? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? None opposed? Congratulations, McYoung.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
Okay. Item 8 is approval to fill one junior assistant engineer position, environmental and engineering services. Is this your item, Mike? Or?
Actually, there's a 8A. We can go either way.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's see. I think it's Crystal's.
Yeah,
Crystal?
Yeah.
Or Sean?
Or Sean's.
right. Oh, I'll take it. And Sean's here in case there's any questions. This was brought to the Watershed Committee for discussion with a recommendation to the full board for approval. We have a vacancy of vegetation ecologist. Andrea Williams left back in November, and we're asking permission to fill that position. As you know, it's really central to our annual vegetation management practices in terms of compliance with our environmental permits, but also mapping of rare plants and invasive species. The reason we brought it to the Watershed Committee is because we're proposing to change the job title to ecologist and senior ecologist for a number of reasons. First and foremost is to attract a wider pool of applicants. We feel that there's so many different curriculums out there now that it would be helpful in our recruitment process to make it a more generic ecologist, senior ecologist. We would still be recruiting for the specialty of vegetation ecologist, so we'll be looking for somebody with experience in either botany, forestry, wildfire, fuels management, ecology, or biological compliance. But by changing the job title, it also gives us the ability in the future to add other focus areas if funding ever became available. So, for example, we could have an ecologist that specializes in wildlife ecology. And so right now that we don't have that specialty in-house. So that's the request of the board, and I'll leave it with that.
Yeah. So we had a pretty robust discussion at the Watershed and seemed like there was consensus to kind of broaden the pool. So Any questions or comments by the board? Any
Seems like a good
public
idea.
comment? The motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
Second?
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? None opposed. Now we get to 8B.
Yes, so this, back in November, Connor Pollard, one of our outstanding engineering technicians, accepted a engineering position for the city of Santa Cruz's water department. Prior to Connor in this position, his predecessor was Alex Anaya, who is now an associate engineer with us. So clearly, with the two prior incumbents, we recognize that the need here is more of an engineering position than an engineering technician. And so we're requesting that we fill this position at the junior engineer or assistant engineer level.
And why did they leave again? I'm sorry.
So Connor was given an engineering position for the city of Santa Cruz. He was an engineering technician with us. And Alex didn't leave. He promoted into our engineering series.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So this is raising the position from technician to either junior or
Or assistant engineer.
assistant. So slight salary.
Slight
bump.
increase, yes.
Okay.
Sounds good to me. I'll move approval.
Is there a second?
Second?
Any public comment?
Thank
Okay,
you.
seeing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed. Item 9. Do we need to discuss future meetings at this point? Agenda items?
Well, we have 2, right?
I think they're already calendared. I have no questions about it.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, I guess we're going to be adjourned then. Thank you all very much.